Okay, once again, good afternoon and welcome to Community Development. Last week we talked about stakeholder mapping and we did a brief simulation of stakeholder mapping or stakeholder analysis, where you put different stakeholders in different stakeholder quadrants, and then you came up with strategies to engage with the different stakeholders. I've read your work that you submitted in Classroom. I reckon they're excellent. There are some discrepancies, a lot of similarities between the three groups. Just a little bit of discrepancy here and there, which is to be expected, and that's okay. That's good. Every team has their own unique approaches um, to solving things, so that's fine. And well, I'd like to remind you, when you submit in Classroom, please do click submit. Um, one of the three documents, one of the documents that I received, one of the documents that I received was labeled as draft. So I couldn't. I had to find a workaround to access the document. So please make sure that you have submitted. And I think there's a two-step confirmation to it. So after you upload and then you submit and then you click confirm to submit, or something like that. So just next time, please make sure to do so. That way your work will pop up instantly when I access the folder or when I access the assignment. Right, so this week's topic, community mapping and social networks. We'll kick things off with the community mapping bit, because that's going to take quite a large portion of today's session. We all know what a map is, and in its simplest form, a map is a picture of a place, usually seen from above. A map can picture an area as small as a business card, or as large as the solar system. But most of the maps we use in our daily lives cover a area the size of a country or a state or a town, city. Now, what these illustrations do, or what these illustrations do, is they provide spatial information, not special, spatial information. They tell us where things are, and they include attributes or information such as physical features or actual places you can experience in reality, as town and cities, main roads and bodies of water. If it's a more complex map, it may also locate or indicate mountain ranges and peaks, railroads, elevations, or other elements of the landscape. And I think this semester you're learning how to produce maps using GIS in locational analysis, and you're also going to deal with a lot of maps in site planning as well. So there you go. Um, Within the community development framework, or sorry, within the community development scope, maps usually include political features, imaginary lines imposed on the landscape by people, like property lines and such. Other lines or other imaginary lines would be boundaries of towns, states, countries, imaginary boundaries of national and state parks, historic districts, maybe even watershed areas, conservation land, and other areas that have political units or that have been set aside by government um, or others for a particular purpose. And finally, the maps that we use every day usually include names of important physical and political features. The names like political boundaries, they're artificial and invisible, but they're tremendously important in making a map useful. And they locate us in our world and tell us where we are in relation to other places whose names we know. And that information should give you a background as to, or give you an idea how mapping can potentially be useful in in the context of community development. Now, community mapping here, what I meant by community mapping is it is a collaborative process where you facilitate the target community to produce a map, of course, to produce a map, and by doing so, you are you are helping them identify potentially threatening issues, or you're helping them identify the community's strengths and weaknesses in relation uh, to their place. So it's a visual collaboration tool. Now, when should you use maps? Well, there are seven conditions or seven situations where where you would use maps, or where you would consider taking the community collaborative mapping approach. First of all, when you're determining what the most important issues are, now maps can show the extent and the intensity of issues or conditions in the community. And sometimes they can also give clues as to how to address them. A little bit more on that later. Two, when you're taking stock of the community's assets and challenges. Now, maps can also demonstrate the extent of the assets the community already has to address their problems, and where those assets are located in relation to where they might be needed. Three, when you want to locate or determine the existence of a particular constellation of factors in a population or issue. Number three is like when you, for example, if you're working with, or if you're working in public health, for example, if you're trying to find patterns of a certain disease or a certain pathogen within a community, and how that pathogen spread, then you can try and use collaborative community mapping there. Other other situations when you might other situations that help illustrate point number three, maybe you might need to know the certain numbers of certain people, high school dropouts, employed women with limited skills, or information about, I don't know, other certain conditions. Unemployment among people with no college background, high blood pressure among males over 40, etc., within a given area, and see how these populations, or how this information is distributed within an area. Four, when you want to understand the scope of an issue, scope, a map can help you make it clear that a particular issue is too big for your organization to tackle. Um, it can be a bit too much for you to tackle wholesale, and then tackle the issues straight on. You may then choose to narrow your focus on a specific neighborhood or a specific population, or to take on a different issue that's more manageable. When you're deciding where and on whom to concentrate your efforts, that has something to do with point number 4. Now, unless you happen to work for, or you happen to be in charge of a large organization with significant resources, it's likely that you have to consider carefully what you can do with the funding that you have and the personnel that you have. And maps provide hard evidence and can be a very effective planning tool to identify the locations and populations where you and your organization can have the greatest positive impact within your capacity. Next point is when you're looking at changes that have taken place over time. There are really 3 reasons that you want to do this. Maybe if you want to observe changes that have taken place over time. First, maybe to track the course of an issue or condition from some time in the past until the present, to determine the trends or in which direction it's moving. For example, is homelessness in the community increasing or decreasing? Is a particular medical condition more or less common than in the past? Is it more common now than it was in the past? Or is it not as common today as it was in the past, and so on? Second reason would be to identify changes in demographic and other factors that may influence how you work in the community. Has there been a shift, for instance, in the major ethnic groups in the community? Has the population density changed, or has the median income grown? That sort of thing. And the third reason is to determine whether your work has had the desired effect. Has there been a significant decrease in teen pregnancy in the area you work in, for example, compared to neighboring areas, since you started your teen pregnancy prevention effort? So a lot of the illustrations that I use have a lot to do with social issues and public health issues, and I think because this is a community development unit, I reckon we can take that bit of spatial information, we can take that bit of spatial skills that you guys have and will continue to develop, and bring it in and rein it in to help find solutions to public health issues, social issues, and so on. And lastly, last point, of course, we're not urban planners. We're not planners if we don't deal with policy. So the last point, or the last situation where you would preferably use maps to help you present an argument, is when you're trying to influence policy. At legislative hearings, in private meetings with policymakers, or in the media, maps can show, often much more simply and much more clearly than oral or written explanation, what conditions really are in an area or in a community. They can not only influence policymakers' decisions directly, but it can also help mobilize public opinion as well. But those are the 7 situations when you would probably, or you would likely, consider using maps. If you find yourself in any one of these, or maybe someday you will find yourself dealing with more than just one situation from the list of 7. Maybe you'll even add another situation there to that list of 7. And of course, there's when, where, why. Why should you use maps? Well, it can help you determine how seriously an issue affects an area or the community as a whole. Now, the layering aspect of maps, or on a map, you can layer several factors, and that can give you a clearer picture of, or give you a clearer picture, or give you a clearer insight into the nature, the extent, and the distribution of a certain condition, and make it easier to compare it with other issues within the same area. 2, it can clarify the relationships among several factors, among several populations, or several issues. Now, oftentimes, being able to see a picture of the interaction of various factors make it much easier to understand how they influence one another. Relationships jump out at you from a map in a way that they don't from a column of numbers, for example. 3, it can demonstrate how differently an issue affects different populations or geographical areas. Now, this can be important. This can be important information. Sorry, important information for a number of reasons. It can pinpoint problem areas or problem populations. It can give clues to the origin or cause of a condition, and suggest means of addressing the problem. Then it can show you exactly where to concentrate your efforts. For example, if you're concerned with AIDS prevention, then a map can help you identify areas where population is at the highest risk and where outreach, clinics, needle exchange, or other preventive measures would do the most good. It can also work with other public health issues like the COVID-19 pandemic we're facing at the moment. It can help you better understand the area or the community you're working in. Now, a map can show you a large amount of information all at once. It may, for instance, illustrate for a targeted neighborhood abandoned buildings. It can illustrate population density, age, income, ethnicity, level of education. Now, the ability to see all these factors together can be a very, very powerful tool for assessment and planning. It can also confirm or negate impressions or unsupported assumptions about an area, giving you a clearer and more objective view upon which to base your conclusions. 6, it can allow you to isolate and examine individual aspects of the situation by area. By choosing the different layers to display, or by choosing to look at different layers of information, you can look at the interaction of various pairs of factors, or just look at the geographic spread of specific ones. Continued here, maps can provide a picture of the communities or areas' assets and weaknesses. And seeing these assets and weaknesses graphically can just make it clear, or can make clear just how many positive aspects there are to a community and how much already exists that can be mobilized to address problems. At the same time, it shows where assets are lacking, and it also that should inspire you or suggest you ways to deal with what assets are lacking. It can help in designing, implementing, and evaluating interventions. Maps provide the evidence on which to base your planning and implementation decisions, as well as a basis on which to justify those decisions to funders and policymakers and other interested stakeholders. It shows you change over time. And you can do that by comparing two maps. I know Google Earth and Google Maps have a timeline slider depending on the location, the data availability of a certain location, and you can compare how places look from time to time. And number 9, map is indeed the quickest and most efficient method to create visual information and to represent other crucial information, other crucial information such as demographic, environmental conditions, and whatnot. Quite simply put, maps are very powerful presentation tools. Again, for most people, visual representations are easier to grasp than tables and tables of different figures, or simply oral presentations like what I'm doing right now. And maps or any visual aid can provide simple, understandable explanations of sometimes very complex situations and issues, and make very strong arguments for courses of action. And of course, I mentioned this previously, it helps you influence policy. Now, policymakers, particularly elected officials, they often know relatively little about issues their decisions affect. And because they're so powerful at representing conditions in an area, maps can help policymakers understand issues more clearly and lead to policies that address reality in more rational ways. Now, on this slide, you can see the list of those who might benefit from the use of community maps, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, and the list is incredibly long, I reckon. In fact, I think news organizations and think tanks use maps all the time, as do the greater scientific community. Now, all this is good and all, but today I'm talking about collaborative mapping, collaborative social mapping. You're doing this with the community who may be untrained in the spatial sciences. So you might be asking, if we actually do that, then does that mean that we have to create these maps manually? Generally, yes. Can't we use GIS to help us do our job? In short, yes, you can use GIS, absolutely. You can use GIS to help you with community mapping. However, for the most part, we'll focus this session on how you would conduct a live community mapping session. Why am I focusing on conducting live community mapping sessions? Well, because if you want to use GIS, there are 4 plus 1. I call it 4 plus 1, or 4 components that you need plus 1. First, you need the appropriate hardware. Of course, you need a computer with enough computing power, enough memory, enough video capacity, hard disk storage space, and all that to run the GIS program you want to use. As we'll see when we discuss software, just how much computing capacity is necessary depends on the kind of software you choose and on whether you make your own GIS map or only need the capacity to view those that are created by someone else. Obviously, you've got the hardware, you need the appropriate software. And GIS softwares, they range from very simple viewers, which allow you to view but not create maps, to the full-on map creation softwares that can display a small number of layers or a huge number of layers, to ultra powerful applications that can handle and display enormous amounts of data. Some software can create and display GIS maps from a website, making them accessible to large numbers of users at a time. And other types of software can embed GIS capacity into non-GIS softwares and programs, and so on. So it really depends on what you want to do with it. And of course, number 3, you need the necessary data, or in fact, you need good. Not just the necessary ones, but you need good data. GIS softwares, they can't create a map on their own unless it has the information to do so. Now, this comes from data that the software has to use. There are usually 2 kinds of data necessary to do so. Spatial data, of course, that help you locate objects, buildings, open spaces, forests, roads, rivers, political boundaries, or administrative boundaries, and whatnot. And then attribute data. These are the data that give you information about the area that you're interested in, and the people and features that exist there. And some possible data, like some possible attribute data, would be who lives where, and how many people, who lives where, and how many of them per square kilometer, where different kinds of businesses are concentrated, how land is used, and so on and so forth. So that's 3 components, and the last component is people trained to actually use the system. And softwares, no matter how good they are, they're only useful if it's used properly, and if all of its abilities are taken advantage of. Hey, wait. So where was I? Train people. Yeah. So you need train people you need people who actually can use the system. So, and that makes it a bit unfeasible for those who are uncomfortable with the software, or even have phobia towards technology. And lastly, the +1, you need analytical methods to produce conclusions, to draw conclusions. And only if you analyze the data correctly will it help you in understanding trends, managing needs, addressing and improving current conditions, and of course, planning for the future. As far as the most powerful softwares and the most powerful computers can do, they can only suggest what you should do. They can only help you by providing options. But in the end, you still need to analyze these things, and then you draw your own conclusions. So let's get on with the community mapping. There are 6 steps in general to creating or to conducting a community mapping session. The data gathering, or the gather data, or the data collection part, and the creating map and the map creation bit can be done simultaneously if you're conducting a live community mapping session. So, for example, if you're but before you start the community mapping session, maybe the data gathering or the data collection stage would be called the literature review, and you're collecting variables of what you're gathering variables or observation points. What would you want to ask? What would you like to observe, and so on. And then those points of observations are the ones that you bring forth when you do the actual mapping session. So let's move on and have a look at the first stage, which is framing the question. Now, community mapping is tied with geography. Therefore, the questions you might want to answer or the questions that you might want to pose to post would have something to do with place. What are, were, or will be the conditions, or what's happening, what has happened, or is it going to happen in a specific place, and what does that mean, and so on. Fundamentally, there are 5 types of questions that community mapping can help you answer, and you may be asking more than one of these questions, or maybe you might be asking all 5 questions at the same time. What exists at a particular location? Here, you're not necessarily looking for reasons, but simply for what is there. A land trust might ask where all the undeveloped land in its community is, for instance. A homeless shelter might want to look at all the affordable housing in a neighborhood. So, what exists in a particular location? So, what exists where? And then, where is the best place or the worst place to put something or someone? A school district may look at patterns um, of certain of certain wouldn't really say that. How do we say this one? Say for example, you're targeting refugees, migrant communities, or refugees. And you're working together with the local bureau or with the local board of education. So you might be looking at patterns of refugee residents within a community to see which schools or which families might need bilingual support or bilingual programs, for example. Crime territories or vulnerable locations or locations of youth violence might help an organization decide where to place street outreach workers. A geological map can help community planners decide where to dig town wells or where it's safe to allow for a factory that releases certain chemicals into the soil. What changes have there been in a specific period? Now, you might ask this question as part of a community assessment or an advocacy campaign. For example, has an issue become more or less serious in the last 2 years? Or as part of a planning process, maybe has the population changed over time so that you should use an approach other than the standard one? Or maybe the changes will be as part of an evaluation. Has our work had the desired effect on the community? And so on. And then the other question is, what patterns can we find in the geographic data? For example, in public health, are certain health conditions concentrated in particular areas, for instance? And what else do those areas have in common? Where do low-income populations live, and how close are those areas to public transportation or to other amenities? And then perhaps this is the most important quizzical question. What can we predict if we change bits and pieces of data? What might be the effect on groundwater of building industrial plants in different places, for example? Or similar question to this: would changing traffic patterns or changing traffic controls make traffic flow more smoothly, or will it make it worse? Um, or what bus routes would reach the most potential riders? And by plugging in different information, you can look at the effects of different scenarios and use the possibilities to help make decisions that affect the quality of life in the community. Now, the data collection bit is arguably the most important bit in any piece of or in any community outreach effort or in any research. So I've heard of the term or the expression garbage in, garbage out. It's a very common expression attached to any form of data analysis. Your analysis is as good or is only as good as the data you're working with. If your data is out of date, incomplete, or inaccurate, you're not going to get a current, complete, and accurate picture of the area and of the issue you're examining. For that reason, it's important to consider the source of any data that you get from outside your organization and to pay attention to the reliability of any information you've collected yourself. As your data will be coming from the community, you may need to pay attention to key stakeholders in the community. You can conduct a stakeholder analysis prior to the community mapping activity to help you identify key stakeholders, and you've already had a try or had a hand in that. If you're conducting a live community mapping session, at this stage, as I mentioned, you're not going to gather data yet. You may just need to collect points of observation that you will ask the community during the mapping session. But if you're using a mapping software such as GIS, then you can use or you can collect secondary data that you will enter to the system once they've been collected. And if you're combining the GIS analysis with the live community session, it might be a good idea if you gather the data first, you put it through the system, and then you create a map of what you think the current conditions are, and then you confirm it with the community, and they can, and then they can help you correct any or fill in any incomplete data. Of course, there are two types of data: spatial or map data, which locate geographic areas and objects. That they include political and other boundaries, and then attribute data, which tell you about those areas and objects. The data needed then include the actual map information for the whole area you want to look at. It can be broken down in ways that will give you the information you want into counties, for example, into census tracts, into different neighborhoods, into city blocks, into towns, depending on the scale of the community you're working with, and the information that describes and differentiates the people, environment, or activities within that area. Some of the most common types of data that might be of use are demographic data, those that identify people in an area by different categories or different levels of categories. And so it really depends. There's no one size fits all solution to this. There's no guidelines as to what sort of data you would actually need, because every context or every project has their own uniqueness and their own requirements. So the list could go on and on. There are as many possibilities for data that might be needed as there are possibilities for a condition, an event, a population, or a situation that relate to a place. Okay. Although this kind of information is beyond what is shown on most digital maps or most openly available digital maps, or if you purchase a highway map. And these types of information that you see on the slide here can be found by actually going to the place in question and looking around. There is much information that isn't visible in this way, however. A good example is the location of traffic accidents. That information is tied to specific places, but you wouldn't know that just by going to the place. Now, you'd have to have someone tell you this is the location of a certain accident, so and so. It took place. It took place at a certain date and time. It involved so and so people and so on. Now, unlike spatial information, it's more than just a picture of the landscape. It tells you what happened there as well. So in addition to showing you what happened where, a map can also tell you about the lives of the people who live there, the geology or soil chemistry of the area, the ranges of its endangered species, the spread of disease in its human or in its animal population, or the rate of its development. And you can differentiate these by using different colors or patterns, just as they often do to distinguish between states or counties. There are many kinds of differences that maps can show. Different levels of population density, where different ethnic or racial groups are concentrated, different income levels in different areas, increases in housing starts for various areas, or increases or perhaps the different levels of housing demand or housing need for various areas, current ranges of endangered species, and whatnot. So once you've got all your variables, or your points of observation collected, tabulated, you might still need to perhaps even clean it up, organize them to ensure ease of access. If you're using points of observation to ask to the community, make sure they're easily understood by the community you're working with. At this stage, if you're using a mapping software, this means that you might be entering the data, and you make sure that you enter the data in a format that is recognized by the software. Now, that may involve typing in a table, loading data off a CD, downloading from the internet or whatnot. Not all software will necessarily accept data in all these ways, and so you may have to change formats and that. But that's if you use digital. If you're more analog, if you're working directly with the community, then as I mentioned, don't forget to make sure that your points of observation, that the questions that you will ask are easily understood by the community you're working with. So for the following sections, let's assume that we are observing a public health issue in a community. So suppose you're looking for patterns in frequency of a health condition. You want to ask yourself and the community, first of all, is the condition more common in some parts of your of the community, or in some parts of the region than others? For this case, in this case, when you ask this question, you might want to bring in, or you might want to have a separate map available as a reference. For example, if you're looking for health patterns in a community, then you might have maps or data from neighboring communities that you can directly compare. Are there places where it's extremely widespread compared to the rest of the area, or places where it's practically non-existent? So perhaps within the community itself, there are hotspots where where the health condition frequently appears, frequently emerges, but maybe in some other parts they're basically non-existent. And and then the third question that you want to ask is, how does the frequency and distribution of the condition in your area compare to the same statistics in other areas? Is it normal or is it unusual? And then, of course, as I said earlier, if you need to have a comparison data or from other neighboring places for you to compare, to find out whether, okay, is this an isolated incident, or can it be found somewhere else, and can that be considered normal, or or should we consider that thing unusual, and what are we going to do about it? Then, assuming that there are patterns, you want to layer other kinds of information that may help you explain the public health phenomenon that you're dealing with. So, for example, you know that this is a widespread condition, or perhaps the public health issue that you're observing only happens to certain parts of the community. Then you might want to layer in other bits of information, add other bits of information to that. For example, income. Is the condition then related to poverty or relative income? Perhaps the disease or the health condition that you are examining correlates with different levels of income within the community. Race, ethnicity, might there be a genetic condition? Is it only happening to certain ethnic groups, and so on? For example, just recently, Canada has decided to suspend the distribution of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine. They decided to suspend the use of that because of blood clot cases that have been observed in Europe, and now beginning to emerge in Canada. And they saw from their analysis that this certain condition, that this phenomena happens mostly to women who are under 55, and therefore they decide, yeah, you know what, the benefits of the vaccine does not outweigh the risks, so we'll just suspend the use for the time being. So, and since it's a case that has been observed in Europe and in Canada, it's not the same here in Asia, especially Southeast Asia. There are no cases of blood clots occurring in women under 55. In Asia, it may have something to do. It may have a genetic connection. We can sort of conclude or assume. Not conclude. We can sort of assume that the blood clotting only happens in women under 55 who happen to be Caucasian. Maybe it happens. Again, we're coming back to the public health phenomenon. The public health phenomenon could be connected to different lifestyles or diets due to culture. It might have to do with not being familiar with some basic protective action and so on. Perhaps it has something to do with types and location of industry in an area. It could be there could be an environmental aspect to it, or perhaps some other geographical features of the area, local wind patterns, perhaps the air. You can ask yourself, where does the air these people breathe come from, and what's located there? For example, this seems to be a widespread phenomenon in the western part of this area, and then you notice that okay, most of the air that these people breathe come from the eastern wind. And what's down to the east of the area? Perhaps there's an industrial estate or a nuclear power plant or whatever. Housing conditions, former sites of industrial or industry or industrial dumping, and sources of drinking water. So those are just some of the layers that can help you explain a phenomenon within the community. But again, as with the data, this is not an exhaustive list. You can add other layers to it, or you can subtract layers from this list. It really depends on the context that you're working with. And once everything you specified has been mapped, you've already combined, you can already combine different factors and see how they're related. This is where these sort of connections or relationships can jump out at you from the map. If, for instance, all the areas where the medical condition used as an example earlier is most common areas occupied largely by a particular ethnic group, then the overlap will be immediately apparent. If there are certain kinds of industrial plants nearby, that also will be clearly visible. Now, these connections could also be made by studying additional maps, as I said before, or more likely creating other maps, either actual maps or mental maps from written information. However, the creation of additional maps would take a great deal of time, and the results could be a bit less obvious, could be a lot less obvious, and it can probably veer you a little bit off track. Now, the point of using maps is to create a picture of the situation quickly and accurately, and then to be able to manipulate that picture in different ways. But the more creative you are, the better you understand your community. The more people you involve in analysis, the more history and context you are aware of, and the more useful and the more accurate your analysis will be. So up until this point, continuously involve the community that you're working with. And then if we reflect, or if we look back at the medical condition example again, you might notice that we haven't asked whether there are other areas occupied by the same ethnic group where the condition is not common, or whether other ethnic groups who live in the same relationship as this one to industrial plants seem to avoid similar medical problems. All right. If anything like that becomes slightly or presents itself to you, then ask yourself what, if anything, is unique about this group at this place. You shouldn't respond to only what you see, but also to what you don't see, to make full use of the information generated by the maps. Keep an open mind. You may believe you know the answers to your questions before you start, but don't assume that whatever maps show you confirms your belief. Even if your initial impression is that you were right, continue digging. Keep digging. You may strike gold in the form of a new insight or another interpretation, or another interpretation of what the map shows. Again, try to notice what you don't see. In conclusion, up to this point, maps can be a great tool for assessing the community needs and assets, for setting or influencing policy, for planning an initiative or intervention, and for evaluating and refocusing your work. However, keep in mind that it's only a tool. It's only a tool, and it's only as accurate as the data it works with, and only as smart as the people who use it. Finally, create positive change. Use your map analysis to assist and improve your work and improve your community. Doing a map analysis is not going to do you any good unless you use it for something. The information it gives you should help you in planning and implementing interventions and community programs, in adjusting and improving your work, and in deciding which community trends need attention and providing that attention, and in general, in improving the quality of life in your community. Now, as with last week, I wanted to do a community mapping simulation with you guys, and initially I planned to do this today. However, as events unfold, I think we need more prep time. Therefore, I've decided to hold this activity off until next week. Because just to give you guys a preview of what's going to happen in the simulation next week, instead of splitting the class into 3 groups like I did last time, I'll split you into 2 random groups. One group will be playing the target community, and the other group will play the team of facilitators and analysts. And I'm not really sure what sort of issue we'll highlight this time just yet. I'll let you guys know closer to the day. And then, like last time, I'll distribute a simulation brief or an exercise brief. And just with the extended time for preparation, I hope that we'll have a better simulation experience than we did last time with the stakeholder mapping. I mean, I know you guys did great, but I feel that with more preparation times, with more discussion times, I could have given you guys more. Just an overall better experience. So maybe last time it was about 10 minutes to prepare and then 30 minutes to discuss. So this time maybe I'll give you guys 30 to 40 minutes to prepare for that's 30 to 40 minutes of the group discussion, and then 60 minutes. So split you guys 30, 40 minutes group discussion, the community, the target community discuss, and the facilitators discuss. And then you come together again in the panel session or the plenary session, 60, 70 minutes maybe for the mapping activity, and then break you off into separate groups again. You come back to groups again. For 30 minutes reflection. So for 30 minutes debrief the community. The community group will have a short reflection. How did the facilitators go, and what could be done? What could have gone better, and that sort of thing. The facilitators will use this 30 minutes to draw conclusions, and then come back together again and have a 20-minute presentation and discussion. So that's pretty much going to be a whole session. Therefore, I thought no, if we're going to do it today, there's not going to be enough time. So instead, we'll roll on and I'll talk a little bit about social networks. So social networks, or to be precise, social network analysis, SNA, is the process of investigating social structures through the use of networks and graph theory. It actually characterizes, or it illustrates, it illustrates network structures in terms of nodes or individual actors or people or things within the network, and the ties, edges, or links, relationships, or interactions between the different nodes or the different people. And they're usually visualized or represented through sociograms, which nodes are represented as points and ties are represented as lines. Now, social network analysis is a form of qualitative assessment. It's a way of qualitatively assessing different networks by varying the visual representations of their nodes and edges to reflect attributes of interest. Now, before we move on, I'd like you guys to grab yourself a piece of scrap paper, a piece of paper, or maybe a tear off a page in your notebook, or write in your notebook, or perhaps get your note-taking application at the ready, and we're going to do a small class activity. So just because we're not doing the social mapping simulation today does not mean that you're not going to do any simulation at all. So you guys got your paper note-taking app, or any other application that you might use to take notes ready? Can I see a show of thumbs, hands, smiley faces, or whatever? Okay, 1, 2, 3. All right, cool. Okay. I think most of us are ready. So what I want you to do is divide the three. Oh, sorry. Divide your paper into 3 columns, and on the. Oh, maybe I should do this. I should do this as well. Hang on. Oh, this is not going too well. Hang on. Whiteboard. Right. So divide your paper into 3 columns, just roughly so. And on this column, write 10 people's names. Write down the 10 people that you last came into contact with, or that you talked to yesterday, or you talked to this week or this month. Write down 10 of their names here. It could be your folks. It could be your it could be your friends. Write them down. I'll do a couple here. Let's see. I talked to. Yeah, that's not exactly a name, but talk to my mum. Elder son. Tools. Who else did I talk to? I'm right. Once you got all their names down, once you got 10 names down, or more or less, um, in the second column, write down what their relationships to you or with you are. What are their I'll give you an example just to play along. So this one's pretty straightforward. Spouse. Five. Parent. One. Partner. That's a bit harsh. Okay, you guys have done that. Yeah. And lastly, in this last column, I think you might have had a glance earlier. Who introduced you to that person? um, or if nobody introduced you to that particular person, then you can just write down where you met them or how you met them. For example, my mom. So, uh, uh, lastly, there. Now, when you tabulate this, um, when you tabulate this, then some of you might start to realize that these people actually know each other, or they have a secondary connection to one another, or a tertiary connection to one another, and so on. I'm just sort of trying to give you an illustration of how a simple social network analysis would play out. Now, once you've done this, what I'd like you to do is to flip your piece of paper over, or if you're doing this on a whiteboard or a note taking app like me at the moment, then you can start a new page. And then, I should just write this down or whatever. And then what I want you to do is write down these 10 names that you came up with and arrange them and arrange them more or less in a circle. Could be person one, person two, person three, and so on. Write them down in that fashion. 4 and 5, 6, 7. Now, oops, what did I do? And if any of these people happen to know one another, happen to know each other, draw connect those names, draw a line that connect their names. For example, for me, 1 and 2, obviously. And then who else knows one another? 6, 7, 5, 6, and 7. And 9. They might know each other, of course. Oh, actually, my 8 and 9 know each other. Obvious, and Jules knows my kids. Jules knows my mom. Right. So once you've done crossing all of that, the next thing. And can you turn the lines that you've drawn into a directional arrow from you to a person if you introduce person A to person B? For example, my 1 and 2, I introduced. So I'm changing this. I'm going to add B. And I'll draw an arrow. B. I introduced her to her, like so. And notice your position relative to these as you move along. Hey, those Joes on the fire. I'll change that. Yeah. Like so. Now, as your, this is just 10 names, but as I'm sure you know more people, um, as your network grows and expands, this sort of network or this sort of link, this sort of relationship becomes more and more uh, complex as they grow. And so I'm not sure if I did a good job, but I hope I helped you. I hope I helped you, I hope I helped illustrate the. Um, I helped illustrate um, the idea of a social network, and that is coming, and that was coming from your own social networks. And which I'm sure yours will probably look so much different to mine, um, and so much different from one another, of course, because each and every one of you may have different, of course, have different experiences and have different connections. You're in the same batch, so and you guys have been together in the same batch for the last year or so, more than a year. And I'm sure that some of your networks have merged and created new connections and so on and so forth. So, what exactly is a social network? Now, it's easy to think nowadays when if it's easy to think of a social network as something like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, um, or any similar websites or applications that call themselves social media, and it is indeed sort of a social network. It is a virtual or an online social network, and indeed, this kind of network is representative of the broader class of networks called social. The essential characteristics of a social network are a first it has to be a collection of entities that participate in within the network. Typically, these entities are people, but they could be something else entirely. There is at least one relationship between entities of this network or of the network. On Facebook or similar social media sites, this relationship is called friend friends. I think that's the first time I heard of the term unfriend, that you can unfriend someone, you can unfriend them on Facebook. Sometimes the relationship is all or nothing. Two people are either friends with each other or they're not. However, in other examples of social networks, the relationship has a degree, a degree of friendship. This degree of friendship or this degree of relationship could be discrete, for example, friends, family, acquaintances, or none whatsoever. Um, the relationship could be represented in a number value. It could be a number. For example, it could be the fraction of the day that two people spend talking to each other. They're not friends, but for half an hour, they had a relationship. They were talking to each other on the phone, or they had a video call. But they're not friends, they're not colleagues, they're not family. So it really depends. The relationship between two entities or two individuals can be represented as, again, as in a qualitative way. Um, Friends, acquaintances, and so on, or categorically. Sorry, can be categorically represented, or it can be represented as or it can be represented quantitatively. And third, there is an assumption of non-randomness or locality. This is the condition that is really hard to explain, actually. But the intuition is that relationships tend to cluster. For example, if A is related to both B and C, then there is a high probability that B and C are related, as in A knows B and C. So there's a high chance that B and C know each other, whether it is through A or they know each other directly. If you happen to participate in LinkedIn, there's a good LinkedIn is a good example of how this non-randomness assumption is represented. Those of you who are in direct contact are called first degree contacts. And then, for example, if you're person A and you know B and you're directly connected to them, you guys are college buddies, for example. And then A knows C, but they're not connected, but C is connected to B, and therefore C is a second degree connection, and so on and so forth. So I think that's one way of explaining this assumption of non-randomness or locality. Social networks are naturally modeled as networks or as graphs, which we sometimes refer to as social graphs. Now, the entities or the individuals are represented as nodes, the little dots, circles, and the line that connects the two nodes are called edges. Now, if the nodes are related by the relationship that characterizes the network, if there is a degree associated with the relationship, this degree is represented by, you can represent these degrees by labeling the edges. For example, in this line, you might say spouse, or you might say friend, colleague, and whatnot. You guys have just made your social network map. Here is perhaps a simpler sample of a small social network. I'm sure that your networks are a lot more complicated than this. But as I mentioned, A, B, and C. Maybe if A knows B and C, then most likely B knows C. And if B knows D, then most likely that A knows D, and so on and so forth. So I've uploaded, an interesting book on how to analyze social networks in Classroom, and it's quite interesting. But somehow I just couldn't wrap my head around the book enough to make a general conclusion to include in this session. But I've uploaded it. It's from I think it's a book chapter from Stanford University, so you should find it interesting as well. Anyways, what are the what are the what are the obvious benefits of doing a social network analysis? Have a look again at the social network grid and map that you just created, and then think about the following things. Um, First, what are the common objects that brought you and the people in your network together, other than, for example, me and my mom by birth? Um, but are there any other common objects that brought you together? Are they common, not objects, but are there common interests that brought you and your people in your network together? Now, this demonstrates that social networks don't really form randomly, but social networks form with a sense of purpose. There's a sense of purpose in forming social networks. There's usually a common object or a common objective that connects you to the other person. Perhaps you share the same hobby. Perhaps your siblings go to the same school. Or if you have kids, then perhaps your children go to the same school. Or maybe it's something deeper, like an ethnic association. She's from East Java as well, so I know her, and we click because she's from East Java, or he's from a certain town or a little town that you grew up in, and that's how you connect. And then I want you to think about this. I want you to think about the potential social capital that you have through your network. Think of how the people in your network, in the network map that you just created briefly, um, think of how they may, now think of where they may take, think of the places they may take you, or you may not see it now, but perhaps in the future you might reflect on your network and map out the people that have helped you along the way, or perhaps even map out the people that you might have pushed aside or trampled on. And that brings me to the last point. When you when you analyze a social network, even if it's your own social network, it allows you to identify where your strong ties are and where your weakest ties are. And then once you've identified that, then of course you should be then you should come up with ways or ideas on how to uh, maintain the strength in your the strength in ties in your social networks, and perhaps work or, or come up with a strategy to work on the weakest ties and how to strengthen them in the future, and so on. And of course, but that's just you. That's just you. So if you take this mapping activity into the greater society, then you might help find the weak links within a social structure and then address them so that you can bolster their strength and therefore help society work just a tiny bit better than before. Now, the social network analysis approach can be applied in the real world, but if you prefer to observe if you prefer to observe social phenomena virtually, you can apply the social network analysis approach to digital data. You can mine data on certain trends or social phenomena, by analyzing hashtags on social media to see who interacted with the hashtags. And well, because we are geographers essentially, if you assign a geotag to the social media account handle that interacts with the hashtag, and I think that is now a huge part of the social media experience. Then you can also analyze the hashtags spatially. So yeah, it happens in a virtual platform. However, where people access it from, where people interact with the hashtags are coming from, is a very physical location. It has a very strong spatial aspect to it, and I think the sort of social network analysis, if you decide to dive deeper into it, and if you decide to study it further, I think this would be a very very interesting approach to continue learning and developing. Right. So that's actually all I have for today. I'll continue uploading additional references prior to our community mapping exercise next week. Hopefully, that will help you. That will help you guys. That will help not only you guys, but that will also help me prepare and prepare for the simulation session next week. I know that next week is supposed to be Bu Feli's session, but I've asked her permission to interrupt one session, and she's allowed me to conduct the social mapping or the community mapping experiment simulation with you guys. So yeah, I genuinely look forward to that. So but before we end, does anybody have any questions or comments that you might want to ask me? Okay. If you well, maybe you don't have any questions or comments at the moment. That's fine. You can contact me through private message if you do suddenly come up with a question outside of the class. I'm more than welcome for you to do so. Thank you very much for joining me in this community development unit this week. I look forward to seeing you guys again next week. Actually, I'll see you guys again tomorrow morning for site planning. And yeah, looking forward to that as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this session. Have a great afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.